Wuthering Waves 2.0 was an amazing patch, a leap in quality in many aspects, including environmental design, exploration, gameplay, and story. And the story is what I want to talk about in this video. Kuro delivered a main quest that didn't feel like a horrible bloated slog with lots of unnecessary dialogue and lore dumps, but at the same time they did a good job introducing the new region and its lore. Turns out it's possible. Although it was very easy to fall into the trap of endless yapping, Kuro avoided it. Hoyoverse, for example, seemed to fall into this trap all the time, and in my opinion what contributes to their stories being so slow and annoying to play through is the fact that very often characters just stand there and discuss the details of the world or give exposition for very long periods of time without any breaks. For example, the third part of Penacony's story had very long and boring sequences of characters just standing there and discussing how the dreamscape works, while using too many words to explain some simple concepts. And coincidentally, around the second half of Penacony, players started massively complaining about the dialogue bloat, and it only got worse with time. So why do they even write like this? Maybe because this is the simplest and the most straightforward way to explain the lore to the players. Just have the characters explain it to each other, in detail, maybe even going over the same concept a few times, so your dumb audience can definitely understand it. Of course, if they haven't fallen asleep by then. But it's also the most boring way, especially if such discussions happen back to back, with no action or combat in between. Wuthering Waves was guilty of this too, especially in version 1.0. It got much better with every following story quest. But the first half of 1.0 story was a slog, and it's still disliked by many players, which makes the increase in quality even more impressive. So I think Wuthering Waves 2.0 is a great example of how to make a relatively lore-heavy story that isn't too wordy and boring. So let's have a look at some examples from 2.0 main quest and see what they did right. I will sometimes look back to 1.0 because it has most of the same problems Hoyoverse stories have, and I think it's pretty interesting to compare the worst and arguably the best main story quest Wuthering Waves writers produce. It doesn't mean that I absolutely hate 1.0 or think it is irredeemable, but it is obviously much lower in quality than 2.0. So with that in mind, let's start. The first thing that contributes to the good flow of the story in 2.0 is that the writers don't dump the lore information on you up front. They make players ask questions first. We see action and only then get an explanation for it. For example, our first introduction to the Order of the Deep happens when we see a man getting sent on a pilgrimage against his will. This scene immediately sets up the Order as potential antagonists, and it makes us ask some questions. Did this man actually commit a crime, or was he completely wronged? Where are they sending the pilgrims exactly? Will they ever return? Or maybe this is just a way to get rid of undesirable people. The context comes next when we meet Christopher, the playwright. He gives us some information, but doesn't answer all the questions. In fact, saying too much would be terrible and would kill the pacing of the story and the intrigue. Instead, his dialogue just highlights the importance of this whole pilgrimage plot and signals that it will become relevant later, without boring the player to death with too much information or Paimon-style repetitions. And besides, most of the conversation with Christopher is optional. If you don't care about the lore, you don't even have to listen to his stories, you can just move on. The other aspect of good lore implementation in 2.0 story is that it is directly relevant to the main conflict and to the events that are happening in the main quest. We don't get unnecessary lore dumps about random past events of this region or some random irrelevant NPC's backstory. Everything we learn ties into the main narrative, which is great because random trivia and flavor text should be reserved for side quests. It shouldn't all be dumped into the main quest. Hoyoverse have a habit of putting too much information into the dialogue sometimes, and not all of this information is relevant to what we are doing in the moment, or it is just a repetition of what we already know. And Kuro made this mistake in 1.0 story too, where basically the whole second act, where we were investigating the tokens left by Jinshi, was redundant, and most of the information that we learned there did not contribute to the main conflict, which was about opposing Fraxides and stopping the Trinodian threat. But as we could see in the later story quests, they learned from their past mistakes. In Raguna, the main conflict is happening between the Montelli family, who stand for change in development, and the Order, in alliance with the Physalia family, who want to uphold the status quo. And all the lore information that we learn is about these two sides of the conflict, their allies or the Sentinel, that is the reason for our being in this region in the first place. We don't even get many details on the Fraxides and their motivations, which helps to keep the intrigue and prevent information overload. But when it comes to our central characters, the lore gives us an insight into their motivations. Like when we learn about the fate of the fools, we understand why they chose to side with Montelis. And when we learn about the past of the Order, we can guess what motivates them to oppose the Montelis. And additionally, discovering this information matters to our central characters. There are stakes in learning the truth. Like when we learn about Fleur-de-Lis, it actually matters a lot. As this is the truth, the Order wants it to keep secret at all costs. And Carlotta discovering it leads to an open confrontation that heightens the main conflict and creates a nice moment of tension. Because of this, players are more likely to be interested in the lore and to remember it. And this brings us to the next point. The lore information shouldn't break the pacing of the story. And by pacing I mean the rhythm of the story, the speed at which events unfold as perceived by the viewer, player or reader, depending on the medium. It's generally one of the hardest things to balance, but in my humble opinion, the 2.0 story is well paced. And it generally doesn't feel too slow or too fast and confusing. And this is because they managed to space out slower fragments of the story and put them in right places. By their very nature, lore dumps slow down the narrative. But it doesn't mean that this is bad. Sometimes a pause is welcome, especially after long, intense action. This is why the lore-related dialogues and explanations should occur at the correct moment. If you have a yapping session with lengthy explanations, back-to-back with another yapping session with lengthy explanations, you get HSR 3.0 story. But seriously, spacing out different components of the story so it doesn't feel too slow or too fast is a skill that Kuro writers have mastered in 2.0 story. Let's look at the beginning, for example. We start slow with checking in on the rovers' wives and discussing the premise of the journey we're going to take. Not the most interesting sequence, but it also isn't too long, and it has a purpose, explaining the reason why we're going to Rina City in the first place, and also showing a bit of normal life in Black Shores. Then we get an action sequence with the whale, and we're introduced to the eccentric traveling troupe. This is a fast part, and it has a combat sequence to keep it going, although I think that combat in the story missions should be a bit more intense, so threats actually feel like threats. Maybe they could add some difficulty options in the future. And this scene also has a purpose. It shows that there is a problem with tacit discords going crazy, and some external influence seems to be causing it, which will come up later. And this scene also serves as the first introduction to the fools and the whole lore bit about the pilgrimages. And this is further elaborated in a slower sequence that comes later, when we see a man being sent on a pilgrimage and talk to Cristoforo. Then we get a longer, slow part with the whole introduction to the city and walking around with Phoebe and Enzani. We're basically on a sightseeing trip of sorts. The writers give us some time to take in the scenery and explore the city. But just as the player might start to get bored, there is an accident with the Echo going rogue, and the flow of the story speeds up again. This pattern continues throughout the whole story. We get slower part when we walk around and investigate or discuss information with other characters, and faster parts when we have combat or narrative conflict and tension ramp up, which in the end culminates in a long action sequence as we are fighting for Lova and saving the Carnival, after which we again get a slower conclusion that sets up hooks for the following story quests. Interchanging slow and fast story sequences helps to keep players' attention without overwhelming them with too much action or too much dialogue. This is exactly the part where Hoyoverse often fail. They tend to stretch out the slow part, namely dialogues with lore dumps, too much, without interchanging it with faster sequences. This is a structural problem that makes the story boring, not just the lack of animations, although the lack of animations makes it worse. Kuro also made a similar mistake in the beginning of 1.0 story, where they had too much dialogue back to back, which slowed down the pacing and made it tedious to complete. But they clearly saw the mistake, and even in further quests in version 1, we could see some improvement in this department. Their later character quests and story quests were better paced and had less boring dialogue. To sum up, although lore and world building are really important to sci-fi and fantasy stories, their wrong implementation can also ruin the impression. And unfortunately, many gacha games fail to present this information to the player in an interesting and compelling manner. Wuthering Waves 2.0 story managed to find a good balance, and there are some things that other gacha companies could learn from. All in all, it was an impressive improvement in the writing department. Is it perfect? No. But it is much better than anything that's come before it, and it is definitely a big step in the right direction. So this is all I wanted to say in this video. Goodbye.